Okay, so good morning. We're going to go over the Unit 3 review for digestive and respiratory. If I'm a little low energy, I apologize. As a 35-year-old, sometimes you just wake up really weird, and today I had back pain waking up, so my back just hurts right now. So it's good old middle age. So what we're going to talk about, I think last time when I did this review, we kind of ran out of time. So I did do a digestive system review last week. So I'm going to ask you all to look at that one. It's a little bit more specific on the digestive system. And we were actually cover more topics than I probably could squeeze in for the two. Um, so I'll send that link out with this video as well. And so primarily what I want to talk about is what I didn't talk about in that video, which is macromolecule absorption. So biggest thing for the test, what you should be able to know for this one is know how each of the macromolecules are absorbed through the system in the small intestine specifically. So understanding whether like glucose or carbs, I'll say carbs, goes through the epithelia with secondary active transport, and then it'll be facilitated diffusion into the capillaries. Amino acids or proteins are broken down into amino acids. They also come through with secondary active transport, and then they are also diffused into the capillary, also through secondary active transport. And then the fats or the lipids, how they'll come through with simple diffusion, but they need to be coated first before they get transported through the epithelial. And then remember that those actually go through the lacteals. They don't actually go into our blood vessels. And they make it through the lacteals via exocytosis, which you can kind of see I had to add in. The other questions you could be asked are vitamins and minerals. So know that vitamins A, D, E, and K are absorbed with your lipids or your fats. And then B and C can just be absorbed straight through with simple diffusion. And then specifically though for B12, you do need intrinsic factor. And that's also released in the stomach. That's one of the secretions of one of the stomach cells, which you could see that in my other video as well. And then all minerals are just absorbed through the small intestine. And by minerals, we're talking about sodium, potassium, chlorides, all of your electrolytes, or any kind of metals that you might have, like iron. Those just get absorbed through the small intestine. No specific place where it actually gets absorbed. And also, again, if you have questions, just throw it in the chat or you can raise your hand. Okay, so going into the respiratory. So I broke it down into a few different sections. You could be asked different questions on divisions. I actually got a very good question about this last week about specifically the larynx and what that encompasses, if it's part of the upper respiratory or lower respiratory. Depending on the research that you do and the scientific manuals or articles that are released, some scientists have labeled it as part of the upper respiratory and they have their reasons, and some have labeled it as part of the lower respiratory tract, and they also have their reasons for labeling it that way. I think for the purposes of this class, we want to label the larynx as part of the lower respiratory, even though it's kind of halfway through and it can be considered upper or lower. If I went back to the notes, it does say lower respiratory division, so we're going to stick it in with lower respiratory tract or lower respiratory division. The other part that we want to be able to divide is between the conducting and the respiratory division. Conducting division is basically anything that is involved with getting oxygen to your alveoli. So any pathway between my mouth or nose, all the way down in through my nasal cavity, my pharynx, through my larynx, through my bronchi, and then to the bronchioles. As you can kind of see here, from nose to the bronchioles is conducting division. So those sections of the respiratory system aren't involved with actually absorbing oxygen and releasing CO2. They're just there to get the oxygen to where they need to go. And then respiratory division is essentially the alveoli. Some of the bronchioles could be considered as part of it because you have some gas exchange, but primarily it's the alveoli that are responsible for exchanging CO2 and oxygen. And again, upper respiratory tract, basically think nose, up until the pharynx, and then lower respiratory is larynx down to the lungs. Ventilation. So you're going to be asked a few questions on ventilation. In this case, we're talking about inspiration and expiration. Some of the ways that you could be asked is what pressure changes are required to have inspiration or expiration. Other questions you could be asked are what muscle groups are involved with expiration and expiration. Like I said, at the very end, I'll kind of go over my circled things for the study guide, but just going through the exam and seeing what kind of questions were asked, you'll have a few on the ventilation portion and the theory behind ventilation. So we'll just go through inspiration. So again, that's breathing in, inspiration. So that involves your diaphragm, your external intercostals for both forced and non-forced. And when I say forced, that's like passive. That's just your normal breathing. Whereas forced is like the deep inhalation, the deep expiration. And then your scalenes, pectoralis minor, sternocleidomastoid, and erector spinae are part of the forced. So you can kind of be asked, hey, what muscles are involved with non-forced inspiration versus what muscles are involved with forced expiration, or inspiration and expiration. For expiration, again, the diaphragm is always involved. The external intercostals will relax, and then it's your internal intercostals and your abdominal muscles that kind of bring in the chest cavity back down to allow you to exhale the breath with the CO2. Remember Charles' law, pressure is equal to 1 over volume. What that just means is if I have a high pressure, I'm going to have a lower volume. And inversely, if there's a high volume in my lungs, there's going to be a lower pressure in my lungs. So remember how that kind of works. So as I breathe in, my chest cavity kind of expands. That means that the pressure in my chest cavity will decrease. And that will allow the pressure in my lungs to be lower than the pressure of the outside air. And that will allow air to kind of come into my lungs and be in the lungs until it actually equalizes out. And then when I exhale, my chest cavity decreases, which means the volume in my chest decreases, my pressure spikes up, and then I have more pressure in my lungs than I do outside, and that forces me to exhale. If you can describe it something very similar to how I did, especially for like the written portion of the exam, you'll do pretty good on this one. Okay, now we talk about respiration. So there's different types of respiration that occur in the body. Remember, we have external and internal respiration. So external respiration is the transfer of gases, oxygen and CO2 primarily, with our lungs to the outside environment. So anything external is think from nose to lungs. So lungs transferring with the outside air, that's considered external respiration. Internal respiration that happens when the blood vessels or the cells carry that oxygen to our tissues, and then the cells will then transfer those gases. So it'll give oxygen to our cells and it'll take out CO2 from our tissues, and then it'll go right back to our lungs. It'll then send the CO2 out with the air that you breathe out, and then it'll take in oxygen from the air. Being able to differentiate between what's external and internal respiration is very important. You could also get asked about cellular respiration, and again, that's more involved inside like your tissue cells and how they use oxygen to help them with ATP production and to get energy in the cell. But this is kind of a general simplified image of alveolar gas exchange, which is technically external respiration, and then capillary gas exchange, which is internal respiration. Again, I wasn't there on Thursday, but I'm sure this equation was shown. I don't believe you're going to have to write out this equation, but you'll definitely be asked a question about what this equation actually means and what it's for. So the biggest thing to remember that is it's kind of showing how, let's see if I have a better picture of this. I really don't. Give me one second. I think the best picture for this one is in your digestive system. gas transport. I think it's part of your gas transport. So objective 4, gas transport of oxygen and CO2. Um, you have an image of the gas exchanges and how they get absorbed into the blood cell and how they do like gas exchanges and things like that. I would look that over. Um, the biggest thing to remember is that you need the CO2 gas exchange as it gets transferred in through the blood cells and stuff. You gotta remember at the very end, you'll have a intermediate of carbonic acid, which is this H2CO3. And then when it breaks apart, you'll have hydrogen ions and bicarbonate. The biggest thing to remember is hydrogen helps with our pH. So if you get asked a question about this, let's say, hey, how does an increase of CO2 affect your hydrogen production or your H plus production? So if you have a very good exchange of gases, if you have more CO2, you should be able to get more hydrogen. That would increase your pH, for example. Um, Again, this is not my strongest topic because the whole chemistry portion is a little bit off for me. And then worst case, if you do get asked a question on this, it's probably only worth 2 points. And you can probably guess your way through it. But I would just make sure that you understand the different parts of this equation, understanding that, you've got CO2 and water, you'll make carbonic acid, and then you'll end up with bicarbonate and hydrogen ion, and that hydrogen ion, depending on how much hydrogen we have, that'll affect our pH. But again, I don't know how you discussed it in lecture on Thursday, but I'm sure Dr. Curley went over it a little bit more in detail. This one is definitely something you're going to see on the exam, the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. So basically, you're kind of trying to understand that our blood cells, they don't always maximize how much oxygen they can carry, and certain things could affect how well our red blood cells can actually bind to oxygen. So I put some of the things here that could affect the curve. So things like exercise, elevation, fever, or an increase of temperature. That could shift the curve left or right, and that will affect how much oxygen your red blood cells can carry. So I'll use an example of fever. So fever, basically your body temperature is now higher, and so you can kind of see if I have a higher blood temperature and temperature of the body overall, my curve's going to shift to the right, which means that my red blood cells are not going to be able to hold as much oxygen as when I was healthy. And so what that means in the grand scheme of things is now I need more oxygen to be able to get the same amount of oxygen to my cells that I was when I was getting healthy. You can kind of visualize this if you kind of think about when you're sick, you're very tired. There's a couple factors that go into that, but one of them is that your red blood cells now can't carry as much oxygen as they could before, which is now affecting how much oxygen gets to your cells and your tissues, which then affects how well they're able to produce energy. But just being able to look at these examples, again, I'm going to go back through here because I did not think I saw the graphs on objective 5. You had a couple different graphs here kind of showing how metabolic issues and oxygen and pressure affect your dissociation curve. So a way that this could be asked is straight up just kind of how I said, hey, if your body temperature is higher, what do you expect the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve to do? And you'll put shift to the right, shift to the left, no change, shift up or down. For the most part, if you see anything that says shift up or down, that's invalid. That's a negative. That's a extra filler answer. You can always cross that out. But understanding if I give you a condition, then your curve should go one way or another way. If you have any questions on this, just message me, or you can ask it in the chat. There's nothing crazy about you drawing this. It's more of if I give you a condition, can you predict whether your curve's going to shift one way or another, which means will your red blood cells be able to hold more or less oxygen than they would normally. And that's really it for the overall topics. So going through the lecture study guide, if you want to pull that out, I'll start on digestive system, which is Unit 5, and the review questions that I highlighted that you should definitely look at. Number 1, so name and identify the location of each of the main and accessory organs of the digestive system. 4, explain the different processes and functions of the digestive system. So that involves things like physical versus chemical digestion, right? We're talking mastication. We're talking about the chemicals like or the enzymes like the amylase, peptidase, um, those kind of things. Number 5, explain the differences between mechanical, physical, and chemical enzymatic digestion. Again, those examples I gave. And if you're curious or want to solidify your knowledge on that, go look at my other video. I broke that down specifically eating how different, if I ate sugar versus I ate protein versus if I ate fat and where all that gets broken down and how it gets broken down. Functions of the oral cavity. So that one kind of mixes 7 and 8 mixes together, talking about like saliva, kind of how saliva helps us break it down, but also you're talking about mastication and the other functions of the oral cavity that help us turn our food into a bolus and then how that can kind of go and start the digestion process. Question 10, 11. Again, I've grouped those together, but the cells of the gastric glands or the gastric plets, so all the different cells like the G cells, um, the different cells in the stomach lining and what they each do, I would definitely look at that as well. That's also in my video. But you can, if you can tell, if I give you a function like, hey, what cell releases hydrochloric acid in the stomach, you should be able to say, oh, it's this type of cell in the gastric pit. Uh, Describe the anatomy of the small intestine. What is the role of each segment? So back to my other video, I broke down what happens in each sections of the small intestine. To remember DJ ileum, the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. Those 3 sections each do different parts in the digestion and absorption. So look at that and make sure that you can differentiate between, okay, the duodenum actually helps with digestion because it's connected to the pancreas versus the jejunum actually kind of starts the absorption process. Uh, Number 15 and 16 kind of group together. So remember gallbladder secretion. So we're talking bile and talk about how bile helps with the breakdown of fatty acids. So again, bile is mechanic, even though it's a chemical, it's a mechanical digestion because it acts as a soap and helps us break apart those lipids. Number 17, so the role of the pancreas in the digestive system. So again, that goes back to the amylase, the peptidase, all the different enzymes the pancreas releases to break it all down. Um, non-enzymatic substances to assist in digestive function. So that's number 18. That's more of like your secretin, your GIP, your CCK, the non-enzymes that are also involved with digestion and absorption. Number 20, gastric regulation. So remember, there's 3 phases. There's the head or cephalic phase of you thinking about eating. Then there's the actual gastric phase of when the food hits the stomach. And then you have the intestinal phase of when the food leaves the stomach, or now the bolus leaves the stomach and then goes into the small intestine. That's also in my other video, but just think about what processes occur as you start thinking about eating to when you actually eat to then how the body will digest what you ate so you get the energy that you need. 21 through 23, again, CCK, secretin, GIP. You can kind of see how all these kind of really sound familiar. It's if you know how the food gets from our mouth into out the anus and all of the mechanical, chemical processes involved, where each of the macromolecules get absorbed, and how they can make it to our bloodstream or to our lacteals, you'll do pretty good on the digestive section of it. But most of these questions are very similar. 26, be able to trace a path of waste molecule from the mouth to the GI tract. That's exactly what I did in my other video, so look at that one. To find bolus, chyme, and feces. So remember, Food becomes a bolus in my mouth. The bolus stays as a bolus until it gets to my stomach. In the stomach, it gets digested and broken down into smaller pieces that we call chyme. Chyme then goes into the small intestine. Then that gets segmented or mixed with other older segments of chyme, and it'll slowly be broken into small pieces enough to where our body can start absorbing all of the molecules and the vitamins and the minerals that it needs. And then once it hits the large intestine, for the most part, it's feces. And then that feces stays in your large intestine for about 30-ish hours, depending on how often you use the bathroom. And then at the very end, it's expelled from your body as through the anus. Um, and then that's it. So those were the main ones that I highlighted for Unit 5 digestive. For Unit 6 respiratory, I highlighted questions 1 and 2. So organization of the respiratory system, which is again the conducting versus respiratory division, upper respiratory versus lower respiratory. Being able to differentiate the four, or really the two from the conducting respiratory division and the two from the upper lower. You should be able to do good on that one. Question 2 ties into question 1 between the conductive and the respiratory divisions of the system. This talks about the functions. Again, conductive is only there to get oxygen from the outside to your lungs, specifically to your alveoli. That's the only purpose that it's there. It also warms it up, does a bunch of other stuff, but the main thing is to be able to get air to our alveoli so we can actually do the gas exchange. I did question 10, so to describe the different or the function of the different alveolar cells. So remember we have alveolar macrophages, so they provide some immune defense. We also have our alveolar cells that are involved with the actual gas exchange. Some also secrete things in our lungs to help lubricate. So being able to differentiate between the different alveolar cells is going to be very helpful for this exam. 14, describe different types of respiration, cellular, internal, and external. We covered that in this video. But if you have any questions or want extra details, message me or go through your notes again. Question 16 through 18, that is basically talking about inspiration, expiration, and all the muscles involved with deep inspiration, forced expiration, and inspiration. Again, we went over that as well. Know the muscles, know the pressure changes that are involved for us to do inspiration and expiration. Number 26, so what is the significance of the CO2 plus H2O equals HCO3 minus plus H plus reaction? That's that equation that we were just looking at. That's this one. Primarily talked about how does it influence the respiratory rate. And then question 28 and 29, what happens to HB? Oh, idiot. Basically, oxygen hemoglobin dissociation. That's question 28, 29. So discussing the curves and how they'll shift based on different conditions like exercise, fever, elevation, or she might even be more specific, talking about if your pH goes up, or if your CO2 increases, that kind of thing. And then questions 31 and 32, talking about the lung volumes. So IRV, ERV, tidal volume, RV. So being able to describe the lung volumes and lung capacities, not in the math sense, but more in the definition sense. Those are the ones that we went over in lab and lecture on Tuesday. And that's it. That's all I highlighted for your study guide. So definitely focus on those. Obviously focus on the entire study guide, but those are some of the key ones that I highlighted that if you can get those down, I think you'll do well on the exam. Besides that, does anyone have any questions or anything they want to bring up before I end the meeting? Okay, if not, you're free to go. Thank you very much for attending. Like I said, I'll send out the link for this video along with the link for the digestive system and an announcement here in the next hour or so. And if you have any questions, just feel free to reach out. Thanks for joining.